When you begin to sew, there's a few things to check first. One, make sure looking in your display screen that you have the correct stitch that you want. If it says 1, that means it's a straight stitch and the setting should be normal. If you want a different stitch setting, you're going to select it for what you need. Just a note, if you turn your machine on and off again, it will automatically go back to 1 with normal settings. For the most part, you're going to use number 1 stitch. If it's got the right stitch selected and it's threaded correctly, you are ready to start sewing. Okay, this piece of metal right here, this whole little rectangle, that is your stitch plate. If you notice, there's all these different lines on your stitch plate. Those are a ruler to help you sew straight. This one says 3/8, this one says 5/8, and then 3/8 and 5/8 over here. Usually we're going to be concerned with this side because there's only a little bit of space before you hit the edge of the sewing machine here. So we're going to put the short end of the fabric here and let the long end of whatever project we use go off that side. To use the stitch plate, you just take your fabric, line it up underneath the press foot on whichever line you want to sew at. 5/8 is the most common, so I'm going to line it up with 5/8 for this example. When I sew, my goal is I'm going to keep this edge always right on that line. I'm going to sew along, keep that edge there, keep that edge there. If my edge comes over here, I'm going to gently bring it back over. If it comes over here, I'm going to gently bring it back over. Just a note, your fabric, you just move it from side to side by angling it a little bit. I'll show you how that's actually done when sewing. So take your fabric, line it up with the line that you want to sew on, lower your presser foot, that is the number 1 key, and then to make sure no weird thread nests happen, hold on to these 2 threads for your first few stitches. If you want this to be secure row stitching, you're going to add a back stitch when you start. So notice, I've got my needle, it's going to come up and down in that little window. I'm going to sew to the back of my fabric and then come forward. When I stitch over the same spot again when I come forward, it becomes a back stitch or a knot in the fabric, which allows it to stay forever, unless you seam rip it. Just a reminder, your back stitch button is this lovely U-turn. So anytime you want the machine to sew backwards, you're going to press on that and it will go backwards. When you want to go forwards, you let go. Okay, for this in action, I'm going to press on my back stitch button, slowly step on my foot pedal, holding my threads, keeping the edge of my fabric here on that line. I'm going to sew to the edge of the fabric and stop. If you go off the edge of the fabric, it can tie a knot in the machine. I've let go of my threads now because I've got a few stitches, and I've let go of the back stitch button, so now I can go forward. Sewing in the exact same spot to have a back stitch. I'm going to keep this edge always on my 5/8, and I'm going to sew for wherever I need to go. In this case, it's going to be the edge of my fabric piece. So you're just going to constantly keep it on the edge. The machine pulls the fabric through on its own. You don't need to be pushing or pulling. Okay, here's the edge of my fabric. I'm still with my 5/8. I'm going to stitch right up to the edge here. And then I don't want it to come undone, so I'm going to push my back stitch button again. While holding it, I'm going to stitch in reverse in the same spot for at least 4 stitches, and that will create a knot. With the needle up out of the fabric, to remove my fabric, I'm going to lift up on my presser foot, and then I'm just going to pull out my fabric. You can use your thread cutter on the side to cut this thread, or you can use your shears. And now I have a lovely straight row stitching here that has a back stitch double row of stitching at this end and down at this end, which will keep it secure. Now I just need to trim off these little bits of thread.